Breaking into retail isn't easy, especially without star power. Many early-stage brands struggle with getting retailers' attention and figuring out how to balance sales with profitability, especially in that first year. Well, this episode of the Scaling Emerging Beauty podcast is going to dive right into some of those key challenges. I sat down with Ray Richardson, a retail vet with over 20 years of experience in sales, retail management, and advising. Here's a snippet from our conversation.
You better get the inventory right for launch. Like, if you do not, you will create headaches for yourself and for the merchant and the retailer. Your time will be so consumed and you'll be, okay, what are the results? And you're like, I don't have any, I created a problem, right? It is an extremely dangerous domino effect to get a launch wrong.
In this episode, we cover a variety of topics, including how to know when to move on from your first retailer, how to balance product innovation with sales and profitability, how to gain visibility with retailers when you don't necessarily have that star power. And finally, we talk about some of the big shifts that are impacting the beauty and wellness industry right now. This is a fantastic episode for any brand that is looking to scale or anyone that's a part of the industry. This stuff is impacting you right now. I'm excited for you to take a listen. Let's go ahead and get into the episode after a word from our sponsor. As of the published date of this episode, I am an associate of Ulta Beauty. The ideas and thoughts represented here are my own and not that of my employer. I'd like to take a moment to thank the sponsor for the Scaling Emerging Beauty podcast, the Emerson Group. Through their support, we're able to continue to talk to industry experts to provide early stage brands with strategies and tactical insights on what they can do to help their business grow better. Thank you again to the Emerson Group for their continued support. And let's go ahead and continue with the show. I know most recently you were working with Will Perform with Serena Williams. And so I'd love to just start our conversation off there, because a lot of the folks that listen to this podcast are emerging brands. So I would imagine that you kind of had an in, so to speak, because you've got Serena Williams, you know, she's kind of well known, you know, exactly. But most early stage brands don't necessarily have this star appeal, or if they do, it might be on a much smaller scale as influencers of their own. So I'd love to just start by asking the question of how you would advise early stage brands to approach retailers and gain visibility if they aren't Serena Williams. I mean, she's one of one, right? So
yeah, absolutely. So there's a few layers there I'd love to touch on. Hopefully it's helpful for brands out there. It starts with the brand proposition, right? So just stating the obvious here, having been a merchant for a long time, the merchants, they're trying to think for their consumer. They care about category growth. They care about trips. They care about basket size. So you need to think like them. And you're going to start as a brand. You're always going to think about the consumer. And so what problem are you solving? What is it that you bring to the table that's differentiated, not only in the market, in the space for yourself to be competitive, obviously, whether that's efficacy, flavor, scent, price, you name it. There's a variety of ways you can differentiate yourself. That's one element. Now, the other one, when you get to the retailer, you need to think through what are their challenges in their assortment. So you need to become very familiar with whoever you're approaching, and you're going to have a leg up if you can answer that problem for them before they can even ask you the question in that first meeting. So if you walk into that meeting and you're very aware of their assortment, and you can tell that maybe they're over assorted in, let's say it's a good, better, best type of assortment, and they aren't really standing for the best, you know, the higher end or some trend that you're very aware of that you're capitalizing on, make that be known and let them know, hey, this is what we offer. And whether that's a new consumer, an incremental consumer, another trip, a new usage occasion, you name it. But that's the meeting, right? The real question you're asking, well, how do we get that meeting, right? Well, you need to start with that proposition, because you're going to fail if you get a meeting and you don't have that. Now, how do you get that meeting? One of the main ways is obviously brokers are out there, right? When you think about big box retailers, there are brokers out there that act as representatives for smaller brands And they have an existing relationship with these retailers. And they can help you navigate a lot of those relationships. The buyers, each buyer can be unique. They will know what they do not like. They'll understand how much time they're willing to give you, what kind of I's you want to dot and T's you want to cross before you interact with so-and-so. They can be extremely helpful in those softer areas of how do I engage with this retailer. And then the last thing I'd say is with a lot of brands, sometimes it's about thinking about when is the right time to go to the retailer, right? So many times over the past 20 years, I've been able to see this trend of, it used to be you just start at the retailer and then simultaneously you start with, the .com. And then, it flipped on its head where now you have a lot of brands, they're starting on .com, they're expanding, they're becoming like just powerhouses. And then they recognize the power of brick and mortar and how to add that on there. And so I think it's understanding what market you're playing in and whether or not you have a right to win first online, whether it's DTC or with its partners like Amazon or starting online at the retailer that you want to talk to. It's understanding how you want to grow in that regard. And a lot of times it has to do with the story you're telling, how much time is needed to convey the story, how the consumer's shopping in this category or your product in particular. And that'll influence how you do that. Because if you have some success online, that meeting will go a lot better, right? With some data and some points on the board and able to say, hey, this is why you need this in your store. Because a lot of people, instead of coming to your store, they're buying it elsewhere. In this case, online. So those are my initial thoughts. And that's the topic, man, I could talk forever on because it's $1 million question.
It's so important though, right? And I think the retail merchant or the retail buyer role is so unknown. Like, it's not like an attorney. You see these roles on TV. You might know of someone who is an attorney, a doctor, a dentist, a teacher. But this retail merchant role is almost elusive, where unless you're in the industry, you don't really know what they do. But it's like buyers are... I always say buyers are CEOs of the category. They have their finance people that they have to check in with to make sure their margins are right, but they're pushing the overall strategy and then leveraging the resources that they have within their organization, pricing and promo, planning to build their business. So I love all of the things that you said, especially that good, better, best. And just for clarity, that good, better, best is a reference to pricing. It's a pricing tier that retailers will all often reference when they're talking about a best price being the highest one, a better price being a mid-tier price, and then your good being like your private label, your value pricing. And that varies, of course, if you're talking prestige retail versus a mass channel. But there can be opportunities within the best tier for a specific category or the good tier within a specific category.
It's interesting because as I've been thinking about this, one of the things, you talk about that, you see about these opportunities, and you'll hear this a lot when you talk to merchants, this term OPP, which we all know, but it's opening price point. And it's really important in every category to understand where the consumer is being anchored in terms of, I can get this one for $1.69, this soap, or I can go all the way to, $20. But there's a role for all of these brands and these price points to play. And it's interesting because I got to see a lot of different categories. And one of the ones I found the most fascinating that you just made me think of with regards to how you can play in different categories, I think one of the most interesting cases was in the men's shave category. In the men's shave category, this is probably 2013, 2016, Gillette is a tremendous brand with tremendous innovation, the leader in the category. And if you're a man who shaves, those are the blades. They're the best. But with that came consistent price increases. So as a man, you knew each year, man, it just seems like these 4-pocket blades is getting more and more expensive over time. And a lot of that, the brand will tell you it's innovation and things like that. And, that's debatable. There's probably definitely elements of that because they were constantly innovating. Anyone who knows, let's add 88 blades, all those jokes, and then there's the pivot. They do tremendous things. However, what started happening between 2013 and 2016, a few different brands recognized, like, man, I'm paying $20 for 4 cartridges. And they started realizing this is way too much. And so, we all know about Dollar Shave Club. We all know about Harry's, and there's some others, I believe, out there. But those are the 2 big ones that recognize we can provide a product that's good enough at a reasonable price point, okay? And as my team that was running the category, we would look at the data, we would hear from the consumers, and we would hear like, yes, the number one brand is the number one brand, but these other brands are good enough. The price to value ratio in the shave category was getting off to the consumer, and they were starting to vote with their wallet. And all of a sudden you started to see these new DTC offerings just grow tremendously because people are like, look, I don't need the world's best rate. This is really good, and especially for what I'm paying. And that's a great example of seeing an opportunity, understand this good, better, best, and there's a value and a price associated with it in terms of equilibrium that the consumer is going to recognize, right? And the market will adjust, right? And so as a brand, that's an example of an opportunity someone saw that said, look, there is an opportunity to still make money, provide a great product, and serve the consumer. You just made me think of that. You didn't even ask me about that, but
that was good, though.
That is one of the best examples I had firsthand view of, and I got to see lots of decisions that were made, both on the brand and the retail side, that had serious ramifications. But at the end of the day, it was the consumer that was voting, and they were dictating on what was going to happen. Now, back to your point about the demystification of the buyers. I mean, your analogy is very well said. These buyers or merchants, they are the CEO of their category. And the brands that have the ability to put on that hat, to look at it through that category lens in a way that helps them understand the point of view of a merchant, I think it helps them with their conversations, getting on the same page, speaking the same language more quickly with a merchant and a merchant team. If you're thinking like that, many of the things won't be as much of a mystery. Now, there's personalities involved. Everyone's a human. So,
right.
Present company included, right? Merchants have a reputation, right? And a lot of it's because
they have a lot of power and control.
They have a lot of power.
So they have the ability to just say what they want, and
that's 100% true. And in their defense,
they have a lot on their plate too.
They have a lot on their plate. Everyone wants the piece. And so many times they just have zero patience for nonsense. The more you can speak their language and get to the point quick and show them how you're helping them in their category and or their consumer and their retail stores, the better off you're going to be.
I know, as you mentioned that too, Ray, I think something else that was always important to me as a merchant was innovation. And even as you talk about this good, better, best, I'm thinking for those that are listening, like a lot of price increases recently post-COVID. So definitely consider that entry price point as you think about, where your brand sits, because a lot of folks are going after this better price. But I know that consumers are really feeling the push and the squeeze. But just thinking on innovation, it feels like it's one of those things that is almost required for you to have a successful brand. But it feels also like it is really tough. I have found that this is one area where a lot of emerging brands will struggle. They might have a tight assortment to launch. They go out with that, and that's an amazing thing, but there's not necessarily a pipeline. So can you just talk a little bit about how brands or founders can plan for product innovation at retail?
Yeah.
How you sell it in, if there's a timeline to consider, just give us an idea of how you look at that.
Yeah, I'll give you a few points of view on that because, over the past couple of years, I got a lot more visibility. I had visibility to the sports apparel and footwear development timeline, understanding how long that can be. But that was a lot different than a CPG level of investment with tooling and secret sauces, if you will. Now, when you think about, let's just talk about in the CPG world, 95% of this is going to be from the merchant view. So I want to, just because that's my nature, but I'm going to share some things that I realize on the product side isn't always necessarily accounted for, and you've got to be wary of. And unfortunately, it's retail, so the pendulum will swing back and forth. It's not that there's a lack of interest in innovation. It's that you will often run into what you talked about, which is, hey, the economy's changed, consumer demand's changed, we're adjusting certain things. And the word that no one wants to hear on the product side that inevitably you'll hear during times of, hey, we need to buckle up and get our finances or on the retail side is SKU reduction, right? And so you've got to be very aware of that. Now, let's go back to just being a brand in my opinion, when you start a brand, and what I've seen most recently in my previous role and kind of how we were able to sell in to various retailers, is you have to have some line of sight to a product development pipeline. And there's going to be financial decisions on a brand side to decide which ones those will be. And a lot of those decisions are very obvious, but you have to have, the pipeline takes so long that you inevitably have to be setting some of your budget aside to have a new product development plan and process. So inevitably you have that. And I found that a brand that comes in and focuses on what they have now and why that matters and how they're investing in that and how they're standing behind it, marketing behind it, is extremely important. But giving me a little glimpse in terms of how they are looking beyond and a peek behind the curtain in terms of like, this is the opportunity we see with our product, our brand, and our category, that is, I find, very powerful. Now, why I say I'm talking about both sides of my mouth is you've got to make sure that you focus on the task at hand, which is establishing your existing product. And like you talked about, products that deliver, right? There are times you can just have a great product and have it continue to grow by investing in it properly, whether that's through trial, sampling, things like that. So many times when I've been on the merchant side, I feel like someone's giving me the 88th version of the same thing, different flavor of the same toothpaste as an example. And so you're like, look, we're starting to run into a paradox of choice here with the consumer, and I'm being tasked as a merchant to line this up because too many SKUs makes reliability very difficult. Inventory management becomes a little more complex. So that's one thing you need to be cognizant of. And I just share that because I think you most definitely need to have line of sight to what your brand can be expanding into. You better be thinking 3 years out. However, they will not be 3 years out if you not deliver on the assortment you're presenting currently to the retailer, and you don't have a very robust plan to grow that in the short term and the long term. I mean, quite frankly, if you can keep the trajectory of that existing product line growing, that's a tremendously successful story for you. And from an investment perspective, the return on your investment is going to be much more, it's just better, obviously, as a brand. But something that brands need to be cognizant of in today's world is the concern of SKU proliferation, what that looks like, being able to maybe speak to how your product has a right to exist, how it's completely differentiated than something's already there, and knowing that there's undoubtedly going to be a push for private label in a ton of categories, depending on what that category is, to your point, where times may be tougher, consumer demand's down, and people are trying to lead in with the opening price point, in most cases, which is private label. You need to make a case for why you aren't also doing the same thing, you know, that this product is doing at half the cost and twice the margin.
That's really good. And even as you talk about that innovation pipeline, I know from being at different retailers, it varies. So I would almost even say brands should talk to their merchant if they're already in or if they're having conversations with retailers to ask, what is your expectation in terms of innovation? Is the expectation that I have new product every year, every quarter? To your point, in apparel, we had innovation 6 times a year. Mm-hmm. Beauty, it's not going to be that often, but it might be more frequent in color cosmetics where you have more trend, more opportunities for drops depending on license opportunities. So it really does depend on the category. You want to plan and build into your budget, build the markdowns in, because if you have innovation, to your point, with that SKU reduction, that's typically going to be a 1-for-1. It's rare these days that you bring a new item in and the buyers aren't saying, well, you need to stay SKU neutral. And that's to your point about inventory management. And I think that's a good segue into the next question, because you have experience in sales, retail management, advising. You clearly know some things about inventory management. What would you say is the most critical to get right? And it might be a blend, but I'm thinking, across inventory management, marketing, your retailer launch, like those big pieces that are some of those foundations of like nailing a launch. Let's say perfect case scenario. Yeah. What would be your priority of like, this is what needs, how it needs to be and the order you would place in it?
Yeah. I'll wear my merchant hat. The short answer to that question is yes. Which one do you want? Yes. Yeah. First of all, I want to say your ad, you were spot on. What I was talking about earlier, it very much depends on the category and the retailers. That is very critical. Not everyone's the same, and just get the answer. Don't assume. You'd be much smarter for it. As to what's important with, those different buckets you talked about, I laugh because, a merchant's going to tell you exactly what I said. Let's force the issue here and let's really say we have to make a decision. My opinion, it's like the lesser of multiple evils, but for me, it's not a hard. The first one to me is you better get the inventory right for launch. Like if you do not, you will create headaches for yourself and for the merchant and the retailer in a way that your time will be so consumed putting out fires. I mean, you will spend so much time doing things and you'll be, okay, what are the results? And you're like, I don't have any, I created a problem and now the problem's not gone, it's just less bad, right? It is an extremely dangerous domino effect to get a launch wrong, not only because once you're in and things are messed up, those supply chains aren't agile per se. They aren't built for you. They're built for the brand. They're built for the retailer to get product out on those shelves quickly for the consumer. And let's turn and get this stuff through. Now, it's allocation and it's the right amounts, right? And so that's where a good partner, like a good broker, is very important. And this is where you're seeing different brands actually invest a little bit more. Some of these launch periods, whether it's because they have a special presentation that requires a little more labor and they're just having people set it up, pull from the back room, that thing. I'm seeing that almost become the norm in certain big box retailers because the retailers either purposefully or just by evolution, that's become what's required for a brand to be successful. I'm hearing and personally experienced that, I'll use Target example. When I was there and the transitions, it was like a week you had to do that. And sometimes it would bleed a little, last 20% into 2 weeks. That's taking a little bit longer. Like 3 weeks is a little more customary. So the more you can impact that from an allocation, getting out of the back room, getting the presentation there, getting a better read from the consumer is very important. But I would argue that the launch from that perspective, from an inventory expansive perspective, is very important. Being very consistent with inventory throughout. And again, lots of people are taking partners to help there because it can be complex. Unnecessarily so at times, but you want to make sure that things don't, if you set wrong, it's very difficult to correct those things. That's why I put that one first. And then after that, what I've seen is a lot of retailers, and I think they're right to do this, will push brands on the marketing side. Because a lot of times as a smaller brand, you'll get into a retailer like, ooh, I got into so-and-so. I got into this huge retailer. I've made it. And then the merchant will be like, no. What are you doing to drive this brand? I brought you in, but you still need to continue to drive this brand and the awareness, because if you do want to participate in my retail marketing, it's going to cost. It's not going to be affordable for the average entry-level brand or startup brand. And so that's something as a brand you will have to be very cognizant of if you aren't already, that I will be pushed a lot on what am I doing from a marketing perspective out the gate to continue to drive awareness and trial on your product line. So those are the ones that stand out the most of that list you told me, but you'll see that launch and that, because you can't have the market, you can't have any of that stuff if you don't have that product in the store and set properly.
Even see what your sales are. It's like you don't know, well, did we hit the peak for sales? Well, I don't know because we didn't have product on the shelf. So we don't know if it's not selling because there's no product, or we don't know if it's not selling because it's sold out. I mean, it really puts you and the retailer in a tough spot. To your point, you don't want to be there. You don't want that.
You really don't. It's tough. I've been on both sides of it. It's not fun for anyone because the impression is that if you're a merchant, you're like, what? This is a waste of my time. I'm trying to drive sales. I'm over here chasing my tail. And I'll speak for myself as a merchant. I did not really appreciate problems that could have been prevented. Stuff's always going to happen. I like to consider myself fair when I was a merchant. But when something was preventable that just appeared to be a lack of attention to detail, there's not as much patience for that. But there's times, unfortunately, I've dealt with pirates. I've dealt with the Olympics.
Pirates stole some product off of a ship?
Yeah.
This is just wild.
Yeah.
This is real life.
Stolen out of a trailer. Stuff happens. Do you know what I mean? Like, it happens. I mean, anyone who's been in retail the past couple of years throughout COVID and dealt with that supply chain nightmare knows. So stuff happens. And so merchants know that. And because of that, there's so much that's uncontrollable. When something that is controllable is overlooked, as a brand, you really, really want to try to avoid that. So you need to do your homework, do your due diligence, and make sure you're doing everything you can before launch to make sure everything's in its place. And, if you need to invest a little, it's worth it. It's going to sound expensive to have someone come into the store and do whatever for that launch. But hindsight's 2020, you're like, oh my goodness, if I just spent X, I wouldn't be spending 5 times that now. From my perspective, that's again my opinion and my perspective based on my experience. It's hard when you're a new brand, you don't have a ton of money. It helps to have someone with that perspective that can give you that lens of, you will get sticker shock on some of these things that people are telling you need to spend money on. And it's unfortunate. It's just the reality to ensure success sometimes. But having a partner that can kind of tell you, well, if you don't do this, this is the risk. And you can make an informed decision on whether or not you're willing to take that risk, which you can tell where I stand.
That's where those brokers can come in and they can help. I know every retailer doesn't require brokers, but they can be super helpful, especially in some of the mass channels, drug channels, food channels. As you talked a little bit about making the right investments and making sure that you prevent the things that you can plan for, I wanted to talk a little bit about sales and margin because we all hopefully want these brands to grow profitably. I know as we talked about merchant mindset, merchants are looking at growing their business profitably. There's typically goals for sales in addition to goals for margin. That's just what we are tasked with. What advice would you give to early stage brands as they're managing their own KPIs? Have you found a sweet spot in terms of product margin that helps maximize profitability at retail? Are there any rule of thumbs that you're like, this is a good cost to retail ratio? Here's how much money you need saved to be able to support a launch at retail. Just any advice that you have on supporting a launch?
So it goes back to what you were saying is it depends on each category and it depends on each retailer, unfortunately. I've had the opportunity to work with the club channel, department store, sporting goods stores, mass.
Which ones are the easiest then? And do they sell beauty products?
Okay, fair enough. Obviously, I have a tremendous amount of experience in mass. I'll start there because I would argue that the most amount of data should be available for mass. If you think about the type of brands that are there and the data should be available, this is one where if you do your homework, you need to start and figure out, okay, what is the category average, right? You can do the homework and figure out what is this category delivering? What's the average price point? What's the highest price point? What's the lowest price point? Understand the penetration and market share across that category to understand what role all those are playing, right? And undoubtedly, someone's going to want, you're always going to get pushed to be margin accretive. But it comes down to understanding, and this is where you can find partners. You'll be able to figure out what that margin for your category, where it may be. And you'll know, okay, this is where I want to be margin accretive. However, be smart about it and understand the price value is there. We just talked about that one example. And we all know, we're going to sell this for $15. And as a merchant, you're like, that's not selling for $15. That's going to be on sale 99.9% of the time. And its average sale price is going to be $9.99 and $7.99, right? And so what is my real margin going to be at that point? I'm not talking about markup. I want margin. And so, it's studying the category. It requires looking at some of the promo out there, understanding how much is sold on promo, how promotional is the category. And you can usually see that by just looking at reg retails and what the average sales price is and the data. But that's a big component of it. That's just table stakes to understand essentially the environment you're playing in. And then it's understanding what's your role in it, right? What are you going to be margin accretive? Are you going to be about top line sales? Is it going to be penny profit? Because you may be a little bit below the average margin, which is a harder sell, but you can get there. You got to prove it with the velocities. So you may want to have some data up front from somewhere else. But if you are turning so much faster because you're a better price point or you're on trend, whatever it may be, a good merchant is going to know, like, okay, I'm taking home more dollars. I don't like what it's doing to my rate, but we can talk about that, right? And you may be able to manage that as a product portfolio in terms of, what your offerings are, in terms of I'll have a different markup and some of my different things. But internally, as a brand, you're going to know. You're going to understand, like, I can't go below my own internal margin of X. And that ladders up to the following markup for retailers, which this ends up being the average sales price. And as a brand, you need to set your floor. You need to know where you're going to walk. Because there are going to be times you develop a product, you're like, we love this. Oh, but that margin, that dog won't hunt. And you just need to learn as a leadership team.
It's always the best ones.
Right? You're going to have some tough decisions and say, we can't do that. Yeah, of course it's going to like that because we're giving it away. And you better think long and hard about if you go down that path, what that means for the financial viability of your company. And so once you start understanding what the category is and then what's your cost of your inputs, you're going to be able to find where you're able to play. And so that the best thing I can say is that you need to understand that category. The competitive data is out there. You've got to do your homework. The worst thing you can do is go out there with rose-colored glasses and think you can, and I've been guilty of it. You need to understand, what are the turns in this category? What is my ramp-up rate going to be like?
And is the merchant aligned with that ramp-up rate? Or are they not aligned? I just had a conversation about that on an inventory management episode with Shannara. She said, if you're an emerging brand and the merchant is not providing you with a different type of run rate or kind of a ramp up to get to the category, think twice. Just think twice, because coming out the gate and hitting productivity to compete with a Gillette or whoever that category leader is, I mean, it happens, but rare. It's a true rarity.
Right. It's so true. And you just touch on something that I think it's worth folks that are interested in, they're about to talk to retailers. It sounds obvious, but asking the merchant, and hopefully with their inventory managers there too, because oftentimes they aren't the same people making the same decision or running the data. Ask the question, for this brand in your assortment, what does success look like? And try to get them to put a number on it and understand if that is congruent with what your internal assumptions have been. And if they're not, what kind of revisiting do you need to do? Like, what assumptions are wrong on whose end? Do you feel strongly that you're right and you need to convince them? Or were you maybe a little bit too optimistic and are realizing, wait a second, we may need to relook at this. They're indicating that they either have a higher bar for us, which seems unrealistic, which you need to address very quickly, or wait, they have us so low. Why is that? What are we being underinvested in? Am I being placed somewhere on the shelf I'm not aware of? There's certain clues that conversation can open up. I know when I was a merchant, I could probably count on one hand how many times people say, what does success look like for me? And I always had a very strong idea what success looked like. But whether or not they brought it up in that manner, you got to be tactful because some merchants won't like that. But it's a good conversation to have because it'll get some things that need to be cleared up out in the air sooner, in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's so important just for your long-term success. To your point, it's like, yes, as we had talked about, like that sales, that margin, that profitability, it all matters. But that's also backing up to a benchmark, something that the merchants know. Because again, going back to what we said earlier, merchants are business owners. They are looking at the numbers. They're looking at sales. Like, yes, very much like an art to managing a retail business, because there is a little bit of that. You're pulling new brands or new items in that aren't always specific to an equation, but the business side matters too. So that's something to keep in mind. I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, but just as someone who's been in retail for quite some time, I know that there's been a lot of changes and things that are impacting brands. I'd love to just hear from you. What are maybe some of the biggest changes that you've noticed recently and how that's impacting brands today? If you have any like parting words of advice for these brands as they're looking to grow, because I mean, it used to be, like you said, you could go to retail and retailers could build your brand. Yeah. That's not the case anymore. It used to be that you could build your brand on Instagram. And now I'm like, man, you can't even necessarily build your brand directly on Instagram, or like build that community. So like, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating to see, where brick and mortar was everything. And then these DTC darlings start to make their way. And then Amazon become, I don't know if this is fair, but I remember, granted, I was biased, because I wasn't working for Amazon, but they were kind of like the big bad guy, right? Like, oh, you don't want to go there, but you
can make a lot of money on Amazon now.
Yeah.
I mean, you can do a lot of volume.
There you go. If you know how to do it right, it's not this, it sounded like it would be the end, right? And that's not the case. I'm not saying it's easy. You got to know what you're doing, but I feel like that's changed. And then, like you touched on it with the marketing, when you went from, I was dealing with these major campaigns, like Axe bodies, like these just huge, the typical traditional CPG stuff. And then all of a sudden you get into the influencer marketing, you got the Instagram. And now I'd say one of the biggest things that's everyone's still trying to figure out is the constant changes in algorithms, right? And the science or lack thereof behind those things. Then you have the social shopping and the growth there, right? What does that mean? You're hearing different things. You're hearing about, well, what's going to happen to TikTok and it's going great, but what does it mean in the future? And then the other thing is just everyone is trying, from what I can tell, I'm not the expert on it, but just been on the periphery, the retail media and what that means for the future of brands, right? Because there's always going to be pressure for brands from the retailers to participate in their retail media, right? There's always has been. But I think they're starting to get more and more savvy with it. But I would argue that there's still not a great entry point for up-and-coming brands. Would you agree?
Fully. I mean, I feel like I've heard of retail media packages starting at $75,000, $100,000. I mean, when you're getting close to these low six figures, I just don't know emerging brands that have that kind of money. And that's where it's like, okay, if you do have that kind of money, then you need to already be established on Amazon. But then many brick and mortar retailers don't want you to necessarily be established on Amazon, because then they're like, they got to fight with Amazon, or not fight, but then Amazon is a viable competitor that has that consumer. And so I think it's one of those things that like everyone is still figuring out in terms of what's the right thing. Are retail media networks even profitable? I mean, I've heard that, or like, are brands getting the return on that investment? Right. They know that it obviously is something, to your point, that can bode well with that retailer brand relationship, but like, it's so many things. I feel like retail has always been moving really quickly, but in the past, like post-COVID, I feel like it has moved and accelerated more quickly than ever. Like, it just feels like there's consistently something new. And I mean, part of the reason why I wanted to create this podcast is because I don't know how brands keep up. I really don't.
Well, I don't know either, but I do think that's where some of these emerging brands have a role, is because they're on the bleeding edge. They're at the cusp. They're where something new is happening. They do the hard work, the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
Starting a new brand is tremendously difficult. To get that loyal following, the repeat purchases, something that has a reason for being. Anyone that's working on brands knows how difficult that is. And as such, so do the larger CPG companies. And then eventually they're like, the hard work's been done. We are going to purchase you and bring you in-house. And I think that's one of the ways they stay up to date with what's going on. You bring some really bright, new talent into your organization that can maybe share a new way of looking at things, how they attacked, a brand problem or solution oriented in a different way that maybe the in-house they hadn't done with some of the other brands. I mean, that's one way to look at it. It's way more than that. It's obviously just financially viable, but you're absolutely right. The change coming out of it. And I think COVID, in my opinion, it was just an accelerant on so many different things, whether it was how we worked for better or worse, right? But the fact that you and I are having this podcast right now via Zoom, remember how Zoom was like this novel thing for a minute, right?
Right.
And then like overnight, everyone's using Zoom, you're on Teams. I mean, just, it was, for a while, it was just like, it was only the cool kids using Slack and doing all these things, right? But now it's just the norm. And then you think about just using words like BOPUS. I'm like, what's that? It's like,
right. Buy online, pick up in store. What?
And it just, the
and
way
brick and mortar retailers getting on board. Like, it's like, okay, we all have to move with the trends or we will be left behind. And no one wants to get left behind because that's not good for business.
100%. I think a lot of the infrastructure behind the scenes that's come out of that, whether, you read the headlines, it's always the big guys, whether it's Target or Walmart, some of the cool things they're doing behind the scenes, they're continuing some of that momentum. They recognize the benefits of an efficient supply chain, how it can turn itself into a better customer experience. It's also a much more efficient use of dollars and inventory if done properly. That's one of the changes that it's not the fun part to talk about, as a brand you better be aware of as well. Because undoubtedly you're going to get some email like, hey, we are now changing the way you operate and deliver inventory and da-da-da-da-da-da. And if you don't have strong operations, that can crush you. And that's another element of the change that you don't think about with brick and mortar, but all of them, whether it's Amazon or not, you better operationally, those shops, they work well because they're paying attention to the detail, and you better have your I's dotted and T's crossed. It's not easy, but it is worth it.
So good, man. I love this conversation, Ray. I feel like I could talk all day about what merchants are thinking about, what their challenges are, what emerging brands can do, because to your point, there's so much that emerging brands do for retailers. The role that emerging brands have is significant. And so I think it was evident in our conversation. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for your time. This was great.
You're very welcome. And I will just like to say a thing for all those brands out there. One last thing. As much as we're talking about this change and all these new things, all the details that deal with retailers and all this stuff, at the end of the day, it still comes down to what is your brand offering? I mean, if you could take anything away, if you have something that is new in the market, that's solving for something, merchants, they salivate when they see, they're just consumers too, right? They have a little bit more power. And they're like, oh my goodness, yes, this is great. I need this in our store for my consumer. So you've got to start there, right? And then all the other stuff is very important. But if you have a brand proposition that makes sense and it resonates with people, that's extremely powerful. You can't lose sight of that either. But thank you so much, Monique. This was really fun. So thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you, Ray. That wraps up today's episode of Scaling Emerging Beauty. Thank you again to Ray for coming on to the episode and sharing all of his knowledge and insights with this community. Let's keep the conversation going and connect with me on LinkedIn and Instagram. You can follow me at Monique H. Benoit. And if you're still listening to the podcast, thank you for listening to the end. You didn't have to be here, so I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you don't mind, please leave the podcast a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts. It ensures that other entrepreneurs and founders are able to hear about the show. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. As always, thank you for tuning in, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Bye.